And this is why leakers ruin everything. That's not a Squidward. But it is not a monster either. So yes, Zaahen has now been fully revealed after he finally dropped onto PBE. This means we got the full model, we got the voice lines, which we talked about last time, we got the splash art, we got the launch skin, and we got his entire kit. Which is definitely something that made certain champion mains twitch. But most importantly, as a complete package, Zaahen isn't really the monstrosity that people thought he would be. And I'm not talking about him being a monstrous champion, I'm talking about a Squidward. And partially that happened because of the cinematic. I am now confident that should we saw this as a new champion without any of the story context, people would likely not be happy. They would likely call Zahan another sexy champion that was here to sell skins. Now yes, he is shirtless, so it's technically not wrong. But with the context of the entire story of 2025, Zaahen became a really cool ending to the entire storyline. And so, let's dive into why Zaahen looks the way he does, and why is everything around him connected to lore. So first of all, in case you didn't pay attention to the cinematic, we now know that Xin Zhao is dead. And I mean he is dead. Under normal circumstances, should someone die, there is the chance you may meet them again somewhere in the spirit realm. But in Xin Zhao's case, we specifically saw him in the spirit realm in the Trials of Twilight, where he touched the darkened glaive and he was transported into the glaive, which is also kind of like a pocket spirit realm. So in other words, the Xin Zhao we saw in the cinematic is his spirit. Which is why, when we see him disappear into a puff of petals, what's really going on is that his spirit is vanishing. The reason why this is really interesting is because technically, Xin Zhao still has a lot of story to go through. That's right, all of this is happening before the Mage Rebellion. And of course, during the Mage Rebellion, Xin Zhao is supposed to be there but not present to defend King Jarvan, which made him spiral into depression. Jarvan IV stops trusting him, and that all spirals into Jarvan not making peace with the mages and instead just starting a civil war. Now yes, theoretically you could retcon parts of this, and you could just say, hey, Xin Zhao wasn't there and Jarvan just kinda went crazy. But Riot can also pull it off without retconning anything. And they can do it with the help of LeBlanc. That's right, it is entirely possible that from this point on, Xin Zhao in Demacia is LeBlanc's clone. Right now, this is a massive tinfoil hat theory, but it could happen. Anyway, going back to the cinematic, after Xin Zhao died, Zaahen took over his body. Which is where we can point out a really big lore detail. First of all, you can see that when it comes to Zaahen's body, the face as well as the overall structure of the body belongs to Xin Zhao. He really did just take the body without morphing it, because there was no struggling against it. In comparison, if you have a look at someone like Aatrox, Aatrox's body is all twisted and weird because it is the Darkin who fought for the domination of the body. Here, however, there was no violence. Xin Zhao just let Zaahen take his body because he wasn't strong enough to fight back Atakan. And Zaahen accepted it without running into obstacles. This is why the body exchange was very clean. And you can also see that this is what happened because of another really big detail. That being the eye on Zaahen's forehead. In case you are wondering why does Zaahen have a third eye, the answer is lore. This is something that was confirmed during the press release of Zaahen in China. You see, under normal circumstances, when you have a look at a Darkin weapon, you can see that the Darkin's soul is inside that weapon. Usually this is portrayed with a part of their body being visible on the weapon. This is why you can see Rast's eye on the scythe, despite Kayn holding it. Rast is still technically in the weapon. This is also why you could see Nafiri's eye on the dagger. It's because that's where her soul was before it was picked up by dogs. And this is also why you can see Aatrox's heart pulsing inside the blade. It is because despite the blade being picked up by a mortal body, his soul is still in the weapon. But if you then have a look at Zaahen's glaive, you might notice there is nothing on it. There is just a blank space where the eye should have been. In fact, if you have a look at the same blade when Atakan was holding it, you can see that the eye was there because Zaahen's soul was inside the glaive. But after Zaahen took over Xin Zhao's body, because Xin Zhao let it happen, the eye disappeared from the glaive and it appeared on the forehead of the body that was taken over. So that's what the eye is about. The eye is the last remnant of Zaahen's original darkened body, and it is now in full control of the newly acquired vessel. Also, as a fun fact, in-game during his joke you can see that Zaahen is trying to use his real eye to cast a beam of light. This is referencing the fact that during his original ascended form, or in other words, the bird form, he likely did have ascended powers of the Sun Disk, which could be like laser vision or something. But after partially falling towards the darkened corruption, he lost the original holy powers. Which also links to another thing we saw in the cinematic. The reason why Xin Zhao was crackling with the golden power is because that was the original power that came from the Sun Disk. And as far as we know, Zaahen hasn't fully lost it. In fact, this is why you can still see a lot of golden details around him, while also having the darkened counterparts growing out of his body. That entire character is stuck between being able to use the holy powers of the Ascension and the Hemomancy. In fact, when we get to see his abilities, you'll see that they do have a lot of dark in red, but there are also golden details in the VFX. But after that, you'll see that the rest is just one big reference to our good old dead Xin Zhao. If you look at the body, you can see that it is referencing Xin Zhao's original Demacian armor. Which technically also tells you just how far ahead they've been planning this champion. Because here you can see that the part in the middle of Zaahen's body is referencing the belt on his Demacian armor. Which likely means that at that time they didn't have Xin Zhao's skin ready. Because technically in the cinematic and everywhere else, Xin Zhao already had the Trials of Twilight skin, which doesn't match the body. So funnily enough, Zaahen is simply referencing the original Xin Zhao. And comparing their splash arts, you can also see that he is referencing the same pose with holding the weapon as Xin Zhao. Sure, the posture of the rest of the body doesn't match, but you can clearly see the reference in holding the weapon. Which then takes us to the in-game model. In his emotes, you can once again see a bunch of different references. With his dance not only showing us Zaahen's mastery over the glaive, but it is also referencing Xin Zhao's training with the spear during the same dance animation. You can also notice the similarity in the recall, but after that we get to the abilities, which once again are covered in references to Xin Zhao, as well as another very specific Darkin. First of all, his passive gives him stacks of determination, which gives him more attack damage. In other words, this champion is about auto-attacking, just like Xin Zhao. Also, it is technically the passive ability that is opening Zaahen's real eye on the body. You can also see that in the passive. And that is because it is technically the Darkin that gives the attack power to the body. Next, his Q slashes his target multiple times, just like Xin Zhao, and when you reactivate it, you knock the enemy up, just like Xin Zhao. You can even see that Zaahen leaves the same mark on the floor during the knockup. His W then, once again, is a reference to Xin Zhao's dash forward, except instead of following through on the dash, Zaahen then pulls back and pulls the enemy in. So it is the same idea of a gap closer, except in reverse. And lastly, Zaahen's E is an actual dash, which sure, that can also be a reference to Xin Zhao, I guess. But the real reference is in the slashing around, which of course Xin Zhao also does, except not in a full circle. And lastly, Zaahen's ultimate can also be seen as a reference to Xin Zhao. First of all, it is a big AoE ultimate around him, which is exactly what you would expect, but it does also technically give him damage reduction. Except for Zahan, it is only up while he's midair for just a brief moment. This is because the ability is supposed to also work as a pseudo parry mechanic. But lastly, Zahan's passive also does have the second half, which is an entirely different reference. Because while it is fully stacked up, Zaahen gets Revive, which is kinda exactly the same as the old Revive passive of Aatrox. Now, if you have a look at the original Aatrox, you might notice that he was also about auto-attacking. So Zaahen might have made a full circle back to the original Aatrox. And let me tell you, Aatrox mains were not really happy about it. In the press release, Riot mentioned that this version of Zahan's Revive should be far easier to balance, because there are specific conditions you have to meet to activate it. First of all, the enemy team needs to allow you to auto-attack a lot, and the teamfight has to be long enough for you to fully stack up. Of course, Zahan can kinda shorter the timer by a lot if he lands his abilities, because all abilities also count as auto-attacks. And so the truth is, there is a really good chance that Zahan will revive during every fight. And so people are currently betting how long will it take for Riot to also remove this version of a revive. But yes, that's pretty much all the lore references behind the model as well as the abilities. Which takes us to one more thing that we can bring up, and that is the launch skin. You see, this is the Immortal Journey Zaahen, which is the skin that also made me wonder, was the Squidward a placeholder for this skin? Is that why in the original League Zaahen was blue? You have to remember, the League engine doesn't have ambient lighting, so it is not possible for the Spirit Blossom map to be reflecting light onto the skin, which means that model just had to be blue by default. So either blue had to be the original direction and then Riot changed it, not because of our feedback, because remember, the cinematic had to be produced at the same time, or it is possible that that leak was just a placeholder for the skin. But regardless, this skin is cool. It turns Zaahen into a watery dragon. This is why the glaive looks like a dragon that is spitting out water, and why his wings look like seaweed. Of course, most of the VFX were turned from dark in red into more noble, watery effects, and every now and then you can also see the dragons around it. For example, there is a small dragon summoned with his W, which then pulls enemies back, and his ultimate has a lot of draconic scales around it too. So yeah, overall, this skin is fine, but I'll be honest, it is nothing that mind-blowing, which is something the players knew too, and that is because the players expected something else. I want the bird form, but the burp please. Bro, if they don't add the skin of his Shuriman form, I swear to God. Alright, please give us chicken form afterwards as a skin. If you want the Shuriman form, get ready for that $250 spin. And I'll be honest, I think that comment is the most accurate. I am pretty sure that Riot knows that people really wanna see that birdie Zaahen. But it is a lore skin after all, and we all know what happens to all lore skins these days. Look, Mordekaiser and Jinx told us that is gonna be $250.